The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Picture this. It's the late 1940s. World War II just wrapped up. Millions of soldiers are flooding back home, dreaming of white picket fences. Maybe a little yard where the kids can play. That slice of the American dream everyone keeps talking about. Now meet Vince Merde, Navy veteran, served his country with honor. Works alongside his uncles in a trucking business, delivering building materials. Day after day, he watches these shiny new houses pop up, like mushrooms in Levittown, just outside New York City. Perfect little starter homes, actually affordable, built specifically for families just like his. Here's the kicker. He literally helped build this place, hauling the materials that made it all possible. So naturally, he applies to buy one and gets rejected. Flat out. Why? Was he broke? Nope. Wasn't he a veteran? He absolutely was. Did he have a bad work ethic? Quite the opposite. The reason was devastatingly simple. Vince Merde was black. And the official rules, quietly backed by the very federal government that insured Levittown's loans, essentially said, sorry, no black families allowed. Hold on to that thought for a moment, because what happened to Vince wasn't just one racist builder having a bad day. This wasn't some isolated incident of small-town prejudice. This was part of a massive, calculated, and shockingly legal machine built by our own government at every level, federal, state, local, all working together to draw invisible lines across America, separating black citizens from white ones. Not just at water fountains or on buses, but in the very neighborhoods where they could plant roots, build equity, and give their kids a shot at something better. Today we're pulling back the curtain on this hidden chapter of American history with a book called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. This isn't your typical dusty history textbook. It's a bombshell. Since its release, it's sold hundreds of thousands of copies and completely transformed how we talk about race and housing in this country, forcing us to face truths that somehow never made it into most of our high school history classes. Rothstein is the kind of meticulous researcher who spent years elbow-deep in archives, court documents, and government files. What he unearthed challenges pretty much everything most of us assumed about why American cities look the way they do today, why certain neighborhoods are predominantly black and struggling, while others are overwhelmingly white and thriving. You've probably heard the term de facto segregation thrown around. The idea that neighborhoods just naturally sorted themselves out this way. Maybe through private prejudice, economic differences, or people simply choosing to live near folks who look like them. Rothstein looks at that explanation and says, hold on a second. That's not what really happened. The deep, lasting segregation we see today, he argues with meticulous evidence, is de jure, meaning it was deliberately created by law, by explicit government policy. By the time we're done here, you'll understand how policies with bureaucratic names like racial zoning, redlining, and restrictive covenants weren't just abstract legal jargon. They were powerful weapons wielded by officials from presidents all the way down to local zoning boards, systematically engineering a divided nation. You'll see how these weren't just about keeping people apart geographically. They were about systematically blocking black families from the single biggest wealth-building opportunity of the 20th century, owning a home in appreciating suburbs, creating economic gaps that echo through generations right down to today. This isn't ancient history gathering dust. This is the bedrock foundation of modern America. And understanding it is absolutely essential if we want to make sense of the challenges we're still wrestling with. So let's dive in. Where does this story really begin? Most of us think of segregation as primarily a Southern thing, born from slavery and Jim Crow. And sure, that's definitely part of the picture. After the Civil War, and that brief, hopeful period called Reconstruction, federal troops pulled out of the South, and a brutal wave of violence and discriminatory laws shoved black citizens right back into second-class status. Think about horrific events like the Hamburg Massacre in South Carolina, where white supremacists murdered black men specifically to stop them from voting and seize control of state government. This terror, combined with the exploitative sharecropping system, trapped countless black families in cycles of poverty and powerlessness throughout the South. But here's where Rothstein's research gets really eye-opening. This obsession with racial separation wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. As black families began migrating north and west during what we call the Great Migration, searching for safety and opportunity, fear and prejudice spread right along with them. Towns that had previously had small, peacefully integrated black communities suddenly started pushing them out. Places you'd never expect, like Montana, saw thriving black middle-class neighborhoods systematically dismantled in the early 1900s. Sundown towns popped up across the nation, places where black people literally weren't allowed after dark, with that rule often brutally enforced by police or mob violence. Even the federal government joined in. When President Woodrow Wilson took office in 1912, federal workplaces in Washington, D.C., which had actually made some progress for black civil servants, were deliberately segregated. Separate toilets, separate cafeterias, actual curtains put up between desks. Black supervisors got demoted. And one of the officials helping roll out this policy? A young Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. This wasn't Southern exceptionalism anymore. This was becoming a coordinated national project. So how did this translate into housing? In the early 20th century, cities started playing around with something called racial zoning. Baltimore led the charge in 1910, passing a law explicitly banning black people from buying homes on blocks where white people were the majority, and vice versa. Other cities jumped on the bandwagon fast. Atlanta, Louisville, St. Louis, you name it. The goal was crystal clear: lock black populations into specific, designated zones. You might be thinking, wait, wasn't that obviously unconstitutional? And you'd be right. In 1917, the Supreme Court ruled in Buchanan v. Worley that Louisville's racial zoning law was indeed unconstitutional. But here's the twist that Rothstein highlights. The court's reasoning wasn't really about protecting black people's rights. It was about protecting freedom of contract, the principle that property owners should be free to sell to whoever they want. Did cities give up on segregation after Buchanan? Not even close. Rothstein reveals how creative they got. Some, like Atlanta, just straight up ignored the ruling, or claimed their slightly tweaked versions weren't covered. Others tried sneaky workarounds. Richmond, Virginia, banned interracial marriage, and then passed an ordinance saying you couldn't live on a street where you couldn't legally marry most of your neighbors. An obvious end run aimed squarely at black families. These explicit racial zoning laws eventually got struck down repeatedly, but the determination to keep neighborhoods separate never wavered. So officials needed new tools. One that became incredibly powerful was something called economic zoning, or exclusionary zoning. This looked race-neutral on paper. Instead of saying, "No blacks allowed," cities would pass ordinances saying things like, "Only single-family homes permitted here," or "Minimum lot size is 1 acre," or "No apartment buildings in this zone." What was the effect? It effectively priced lower-income families out of these neighborhoods, and a disproportionate number of those families were black. especially after decades of deliberate wage suppression. While some of this was driven by class snobbery, Rothstein digs up clear evidence showing racial intent behind many of these zoning laws. Urban planners like Harland Bartholomew in St. Louis openly stated that zoning's purpose was to prevent colored people from moving into, quote, finer residential districts. His planning maps literally listed the race of building occupants to strategize how to contain black neighborhoods. Areas where black families lived often got zoned for industrial use, allowing polluting factories, liquor stores, and other undesirable businesses right in their backyards, while white neighborhoods got protected as pristine residential zones. This wasn't just St. Louis experimenting. This approach was promoted nationwide, even encouraged by Herbert Hoover's Commerce Department in the 1920s. In 1926, the Supreme Court upheld this kind of economic zoning, basically giving suburbs a green light to keep out less affluent residents, with everyone understanding full well who that often meant. Economic zoning handled one piece of the segregationists' puzzle, keeping poorer black families away from middle-class white areas. But what about middle-class black families? The doctors, lawyers, skilled workers who absolutely could afford homes in those nicer neighborhoods. For them, another set of tools was needed. This brings us to the federal government's role, which truly scaled segregation up into a nationwide system, especially during and after the Great Depression and World War II. Let's start with public housing. Today, when most people picture public housing, they think of massive, crumbling high-rises filled predominantly with poor minority families. But Rothstein reminds us it didn't start that way. When the federal government first got seriously involved in building housing for civilians through the New Deal's Public Works Administration in the 1930s, the goal was often providing homes for working and middle-class families, mostly white ones, who simply couldn't find decent housing during the shortage. These early projects were sometimes quite nice, actually, low-rise buildings with green spaces. But from day one, segregation was baked into the recipe. The PWA, even under the relatively progressive Harold Ikes, built completely separate projects for black and white families. They adopted something called a neighborhood composition rule, supposedly meaning projects would reflect the racial makeup of surrounding areas. But in practice, this rule often created segregation where neighborhoods had actually been integrated. Take Techwood Homes in Atlanta, the very first PWA project. It was built by bulldozing an integrated low-income neighborhood called The Flats. The shiny new project? Whites only. The displaced black families got forced to cram into other black neighborhoods, making them denser and speeding up their decline into slums. Similar stories played out across the country: St. Louis, Cleveland, Detroit, New York. The government wasn't just following existing patterns. It was actively drawing new racial boundaries. During World War II, the federal government built massive amounts of housing for defense workers under the Lanham Act. This was crucial in cities like Richmond, California, where Frank Stevenson ended up. Tens of thousands of workers, black and white, poured in for shipyard jobs. How did the government house them? In explicitly segregated projects, temporary, shoddily built housing near the industrial zones for black workers, sturdier, permanent housing further inland for white workers. This wartime decision established segregated living patterns in Richmond that you can still see today. After the war, the housing shortage reached crisis levels, especially for returning veterans. President Truman pushed for the Housing Act of 1949 to build more public housing. Conservatives tried to kill the bill by adding an amendment banning segregation in the new projects, knowing Southern Democrats would then vote against it. Liberal politicians like Hubert Humphrey and Paul Douglas faced an agonizing choice: segregated housing or no housing at all. They chose segregated housing, arguing it was better for black families to get some housing, even if separate. The anti-segregation amendment failed. This decision paved the way for those massive, often high-rise, segregated projects built in the 1950s and 60s. Places like Robert Taylor Homes in Cabrini Green in Chicago, or Pruitt-Ego in St. Louis, which became warehouses for the poor after eligibility rules got tightened, forcing out working and middle-class families, and ensuring these projects became racially and economically isolated. While public housing was being used to concentrate black families in urban areas, another set of federal policies was simultaneously engineering the creation of white suburbs. This is where the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration come in, and their role, as Rothstein lays out in devastating detail, was absolutely massive. Before the New Deal, buying a home was brutally difficult for most working families. Mortgages typically required huge down payments like 50% and had short terms of 5 to 7 years, making homeownership a distant dream for most people. The FHA, created in 1934, revolutionized this by ensuring long-term, low-down payment mortgages issued by private banks. The VA did something similar for veterans after World War II, often requiring no down payment at all. These programs unleashed the massive suburban boom that transformed America. But here's the absolutely devastating catch. The FHA explicitly refused to insure mortgages for black buyers, or even for white buyers in neighborhoods deemed at risk of becoming integrated. The FHA created color-coded maps of cities across the country, the infamous redlining maps, building on earlier maps from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Green meant safe for investment. Red meant hazardous. What guaranteed a red rating? The presence of African Americans, regardless of how nice the neighborhood was or how much money residents earned. The FHA's official underwriting manual, distributed to appraisers nationwide, spelled out the racial policy in shockingly blunt terms. It stated that inharmonious racial groups were an adverse influence. It recommended prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. It even warned against insuring mortgages in neighborhoods where children might have to attend school with an incompatible racial element. The FHA explicitly favored segregated neighborhoods, sometimes even suggesting highways as good physical barriers to prevent racial mixing. This wasn't just about individual home loans. The FHA's biggest impact came from financing entire subdivisions, massive developments like Levittown, on the explicit condition that homes be sold only to white buyers. William Levitt, the builder of Levittown, admitted he couldn't have built it without FHA and VA backing. And that backing came with the absolute requirement that no homes be sold to black families. The FHA even required builders like Levitt to include racially restrictive covenants in the property deeds, legal promises that buyers would never resell to an African American. Think about Vince Meriday again. He wasn't denied because of his personal credit or work history. He was denied because the entire financial system backing Levittown was deliberately designed to exclude him based purely on his race, a policy mandated and enforced by his own federal government. Multiply his story by millions, across thousands of new suburbs built from the 1930s through the 1960s, and you start to grasp the staggering scale of this government-created segregation. Now let's dig deeper into those restrictive covenants. These weren't exactly new when the FHA era rolled around. Clauses barring resale to any Negro or native of Ireland existed way back in the 19th century. But they absolutely exploded in popularity after the Buchanan ruling struck down racial zoning, becoming the go-to tool for private developers and neighborhood associations wanting to maintain segregation. These covenants were literally written into property deeds as binding legal promises. Sometimes they barred specific groups, black people almost universally, but often also Jews, Italians, Asians, or others deemed non-Caucasian. The language was often jaw-droppingly offensive, lumping people together with nuisances like slaughterhouses or insane asylums. Initially, enforcing these could be tricky if it was just one isolated deed. So neighborhood associations formed, getting homeowners to sign mutual agreements promising never to sell to black families. Developers like J.C. Nichols in Kansas City perfected this approach, creating large districts where buying a home automatically enrolled you in an association sworn to racial exclusion. By the 1940s, huge portions of cities like Chicago, Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles and their suburbs were completely blanketed by these covenants. Supporters argued these were just private agreements, outside the Constitution's reach, but Rothstein powerfully demonstrates how deeply government was involved. How? State courts routinely enforced these covenants, issuing legal orders to evict black families who'd managed to buy homes in restricted areas. Judges across the country upheld this practice, buying into the, quote, private agreement argument. Local governments actively promoted covenants, sometimes even sending city workers door-to-door to get signatures. And, critically, the FHA didn't just tolerate covenants, it required them. The FHA manuals explicitly recommended that deeds include prohibitions on resale to African Americans, with appropriate provisions for enforcement, meaning the legal right for neighbors to sue for eviction. Developers getting FHA financing for projects like Rollingwood or Levittown had to put these clauses in the deeds. The federal government wasn't passively allowing discrimination, it was actively mandating it as a condition for receiving federal support. This system faced a major challenge in 1948, with the landmark Supreme Court case, Shelley v. Kramer. The court finally acknowledged that while private individuals might discriminate, court enforcement of restrictive covenants involved state action and therefore violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection. Seemed like a huge victory, right? But Rothstein documents what he calls massive resistance to Shelley, particularly from the federal government itself. The FHA commissioner actually declared the ruling would in no way affect the programs of this agency. They kept right on insuring mortgages on properties with existing covenants, and dragged their feet for nearly 2 years before even nominally stopping the insurance of new mortgages with explicit racial covenants. And even then, they basically winked at gentlemen's agreements or covenants cleverly disguised to require neighbor approval for sales. The FHA continued financing openly discriminatory developers like Levitt well into the 1950s, only truly stopping when President Kennedy issued an executive order in 1962. State courts also tried workarounds, allowing neighbors to sue for money damages instead of eviction if a covenant got broken, a practice the Supreme Court didn't fully shut down until 1953. It's a genuinely shocking story of federal defiance of the Supreme Court specifically to keep segregation alive. Even with court enforcement of covenants finally banned, the forces working against black families seeking better housing remained formidable, and government often played a role in enabling other nasty tactics. We've touched on blockbusting. Remember how real estate agents in East Palo Alto panicked white families into selling their homes cheap, then flipped them to black families at inflated prices? This predatory practice happened nationwide. Rothstein argues blockbusting was only possible because of FHA policies. By denying black families mortgages and restricting them to just a handful of neighborhoods, the FHA created the desperation that allowed speculators to exploit both black buyers, charging outrageous prices, often through exploitative contract sales, where families built zero equity and could be easily evicted, and panicked white sellers. State regulators often turned a blind eye, licensing brokers engaged in blockbusting, while real estate boards punished those brave enough to try integrating neighborhoods. The resulting neighborhood deterioration, caused by overcrowding and families struggling under predatory contracts, then became proof for the FHA that integration lowered property values. A vicious, self-fulfilling prophecy entirely created by government policy. Local governments also deployed subtler tactics. Remember the fight over housing near the Ford plant in Milpitas? Officials tried denying sewer access, rezoning land from residential to industrial, jacking up minimum lot sizes to make housing unaffordable, and supporting bogus nuisance lawsuits, all to block integrated projects. Similar battles played out elsewhere. A town outside Philadelphia threw up bureaucratic roadblocks and made spurious claims about private roads to stop an integrated development. Deerfield, Illinois, condemned land for a park immediately after discovering a developer planned to sell some homes to black families. This tactic, seizing land for supposed public use, became a common strategy to block black residents, because courts were reluctant to question the motive if the stated purpose seemed legitimate, like building a park. The Blackjack case near St. Louis, where a newly incorporated town immediately passed exclusionary zoning to block moderate-income integrated housing, showed just how far communities would go. Sometimes the goal wasn't keeping black people out of suburbs, but clearing them away from downtown business districts to make white commuters and shoppers more comfortable. This often happened through slum clearance, using federal urban renewal funds or highway construction. Rothstein documents how federal and state highway planners deliberately routed urban interstates straight through thriving black neighborhoods, destroying homes and businesses, and pushing residents deeper into isolated areas. Planners openly talked about using highways to eliminate blighted areas, or even the local, and I'm quoting their language here, colored sections. Miami's I-95 devastated a black community of 40,000 people. Los Angeles routed the Santa Monica Freeway directly through Sugar Hill, the city's most prosperous black middle-class neighborhood, after other efforts to push them out had failed. And adequate relocation assistance? Rarely provided. Even school placement became a sneaky tool of residential segregation, particularly in the South before Brown v. Board of Education. Cities like Austin, Texas, couldn't legally zone by race after Buchanan, so their master plan called for placing all schools and public services for black residents in one designated East Side area, creating an incentive for black families living elsewhere in the city to move there if they wanted their children educated. It worked. Integrated neighborhoods saw their black populations vanish. Raleigh, Atlanta, and Houston used similar tactics, strategically closing schools in one area and building new ones in another to deliberately engineer racial separation in housing patterns. Finally, and perhaps most disturbingly, Rothstein details the role of state-sanctioned violence. When black families did manage to buy or rent homes in white neighborhoods, they often faced absolutely horrific intimidation, cross-burnings, rocks through windows, vandalism, arson, bombings, and threatening mobs. The stories are genuinely harrowing. The Gary family in Rollingwood, California, needing protection from the NAACP because police refused to intervene. The Myers family in Levittown, Pennsylvania, enduring months of constant harassment while police stood by watching, joked with the mob, or even punished officers who tried to help. The Wade family in Shively, Kentucky, whose house was literally dynamited after police offered minimal protection, with the white activists who'd helped them buy the house being prosecuted for sedition while the actual bombers walked free. This wasn't just isolated incidents or a few rogue officers. Rothstein argues this was systematic and nationwide. Police departments frequently refused to make arrests. Prosecutors declined to bring charges. Juries refused to convict. The message sent was crystal clear. Violence to maintain segregation would be tolerated, if not quietly encouraged. This persistent, systematic failure of law enforcement to protect black citizens exercising their constitutional right to live wherever they chose constitutes, Rothstein argues, yet another form of government-created segregation. The fear generated by this violence undoubtedly stopped countless other black families from even attempting to integrate. Now, some people might still argue, okay, maybe there was government discrimination back then, but isn't the main reason for segregation today simply that black families, on average, earn less and can't afford to live in those middle-class neighborhoods? Rothstein tackles this argument head-on, showing that even the income gap itself is partly a direct result of deliberate government policies designed to suppress black wages and economic opportunities. For decades after slavery, systems like sharecropping and convict leasing kept many black Southerners trapped in a state of debt peonage, unable to earn fair wages or save money. When black workers migrated north, they faced a different set of obstacles, often government-supported. New Deal programs like Social Security, minimum wage laws, and protections for labor unions initially excluded agricultural and domestic workers, occupations where black workers predominated. The National Recovery Administration codes often set lower wages for jobs typically held by black workers. The Civilian Conservation Corps often restricted black enrollees to menial jobs. Critically, the National Labor Relations Act allowed the government to officially certify unions that explicitly excluded black members or shoved them into segregated, powerless auxiliary locals. During World War II, despite desperate labor shortages, defense industries, often operating with government contracts under federal oversight, worked hand in glove with discriminatory unions like the Boilermakers in the shipyards to keep black workers out of skilled, higher-paying positions. Even President Roosevelt's Fair Employment Practices Committee, created under pressure, proved largely toothless at combating this discrimination. After the war, discriminatory unions, still officially certified by the government, excluded black workers from construction trades during the massive suburban building boom. The GI Bill, while truly transformative for white veterans, was often administered locally in ways that denied black veterans mortgage benefits or steered them toward vocational training instead of college. State employment services routinely channeled black job seekers into lower-paying work. Rothstein also points to discriminatory property tax assessments in some cities, where homes in black neighborhoods were assessed at a higher percentage of their market value than comparable homes in white neighborhoods, effectively forcing black homeowners to pay higher taxes and leaving them with less money in their pockets. Furthermore, segregation itself imposed extra costs. Because housing options were so severely limited, landlords and sellers in black neighborhoods could charge inflated prices and rents, eating up a larger chunk of black families' incomes and making it harder to save for a down payment. Higher commuting costs also ate into earnings, as jobs moved to suburbs where black workers weren't allowed to live. The cumulative effect of these policies was absolutely devastating. They systematically depressed black incomes and blocked wealth accumulation, particularly through home equity. So when Rothstein argues that many black families, Inability to afford suburban homes today is a result of government-created segregation, not an independent cause. He's pointing to this long, deliberate history of government-sponsored economic suppression that marched hand in hand with housing discrimination. So where does all this leave us? Rothstein argues that the segregation created by these explicit government policies didn't just magically vanish when the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. The effects are deeply embedded in the physical geography of our cities and suburbs, and in the persistent, yawning wealth gap between Black and white Americans. White families who bought subsidized homes in appreciating suburbs decades ago gained hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity, wealth they could tap for emergencies, college tuition, retirement, or pass down to their children. Black families, largely shut out of this opportunity, remained renters or bought homes in neighborhoods where values stagnated or declined, sometimes falling victim to predatory lending even decades later. Today, the median wealth of white households is vastly greater, more than 10 times greater, than the median wealth of Black households. This isn't just some unfortunate economic disparity. It's a direct legacy of government-created segregation, because wealth and economic status tend to get passed down through generations, and because children growing up in segregated, high-poverty neighborhoods face enormous disadvantages in education and opportunity. The segregation established 50 or 70 years ago continues replicating itself. Even seemingly race-neutral policies today, like the mortgage interest deduction, which primarily benefits higher-income suburban homeowners, or prioritizing highway funding over public transit, can end up reinforcing segregation patterns created by earlier, explicitly racist policies. Modern housing programs like Section 8 vouchers and low-income housing tax credits, while well-intentioned, often end up concentrating low-income minority families in already segregated areas due to landlord discrimination, inadequate voucher amounts, and fierce community opposition in wealthier neighborhoods. The picture Rothstein paints is stark and deeply uncomfortable. He argues that because our segregation was created by deliberate, unconstitutional government action, we have a constitutional obligation to remedy it. Simply stopping the active discrimination isn't enough. We need proactive policies to actually undo the damage. Reading The Color of Law is honestly a pretty sobering experience. It forces you to confront a history that's not just uncomfortable but genuinely challenging to our national self-image. The idea that those neat lawns and quiet streets of many American suburbs were literally built on a foundation of explicit government-mandated racial exclusion is a really difficult truth to swallow. What Richard Rothstein does so powerfully is completely dismantle the comforting myth that segregation just sort of happened. He shows us, step by painstaking step, policy by policy, court case by court case, how it was meticulously constructed. It wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect. It was a design, a blueprint. And recognizing that design, recognizing the deliberate intent behind it, changes absolutely everything. It shifts segregation from being a regrettable outcome of private choices to being a profound, ongoing violation of our constitutional principles. A violation that continues casting a long shadow over millions of lives right now. The most powerful lesson for me, and hopefully for you too, is understanding the immense, multi-generational impact of denying access to homeownership. Owning a home in post-war America wasn't just about having a roof over your head. It was the primary engine of wealth creation for the middle class. By systematically locking Black families out of that engine, through redlining, through FHA and VA discrimination, through support for restrictive covenants, through tolerating violence, the government didn't just deny them houses. It denied them wealth, stability, opportunity, and the ability to pass those advantages down to their children and grandchildren. That $200,000 plus wealth gap between the white family who bought in Levittown and the equally qualified black family, like Vince Mertes, who got shut out. That's not just abstract economics, that's the direct, tangible, measurable result of government-created segregation. So what do we actually do with this knowledge? Rothstein himself acknowledges that undoing this legacy is incredibly difficult. We can't turn back the clock. But acknowledging the truth, really facing it head-on, is the absolutely essential first step. We can't keep pretending this was all just private prejudice or impersonal economic forces beyond anyone's control. It was us, acting through our government, deliberately creating this reality. What can you do right now, today? First, simply learn this history. Talk about it with friends and family. Share what you've learned. Challenge the myth of de facto segregation whenever you hear it. Understanding the how and why is crucial for any meaningful change. Second, pay attention to local housing policies in your own community. Are there zoning laws making it nearly impossible to build affordable apartments? Can landlords refuse tenants just because they use a housing voucher? These seemingly small local rules often perpetuate the segregation patterns established long ago. Supporting efforts for more inclusive housing policies in your own backyard actually matters. Third, recognize that overcoming segregation requires conscious effort and sometimes genuine sacrifice. It means genuinely welcoming neighbors who might look different or come from different backgrounds, and actively working against the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, forms of prejudice that still linger. The color of law doesn't offer easy, feel-good answers, because, honestly, there aren't any, but it provides the essential, undeniable foundation of historical truth that any real solutions must be built on. It calls on us to recognize our collective responsibility for the segregated landscape we inherited, and to finally begin the difficult, absolutely necessary work of building a more just and integrated future. That was our deep dive into the core ideas of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. We've covered a ton of ground today, exploring the calculated ways our government intentionally created the segregated neighborhoods we see across America, but truly grasping the weight of this history, the individual stories, the mountains of detailed evidence that comes from spending real time with the book itself. This summary is like glancing at a map, but reading the book is actually taking the journey. If the story we've uncovered today has sparked something in you, if you feel that pull to understand this crucial piece of American history more deeply, I genuinely encourage you to pick up a copy of The Color of Law. It's not just informative. It's a book that can fundamentally shift your entire perspective on the country we live in and the challenges we still need to overcome. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if this exploration into the color of law gave you new insights or a fresh perspective, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. We journey through impactful books like this regularly, uncovering wisdom from the billionaire's bookshelf, and we genuinely love for you to join our community of curious minds. Let's keep learning and growing together on this path.